Britain is one of the very few countries in the world which enjoys the luxury of clean, wholesome milk delivered regularly to our doorsteps. The sight of the milkman making his morning round is such a familiar part of our everyday scene that we take it for granted. A regular delivery of a quality product is one of the privileges of living in a sophisticated, technological society. It was a hard-won privilege, gained for us by the efforts of scientists and doctors, engineers and agriculturalists who transformed our dairy industry. Yet the industry, as we know it, is only just over 60 years old. By the early 19th century, enlightened agriculturalists such as Turnip Townsend, Arthur Young, and Thomas Bates had already raised the standards on farms. These farming pioneers were concerned with improvement of stock, for they were unaware of the need to raise standards of cleanliness. It was an age of ignorance. Even the most eminent of physicians believed that diseases were caused by noxious vapors in the air. They regarded dirt as being quite harmless. And 150 years ago, there was no recognizable dairy industry at all. The citizens of Britain in the 1800s could not have imagined a regular delivery of clean, fresh bottled milk to their doorsteps. And if the gentry of the day cared little about dirt, the ordinary farmer and cowkeeper cared even less. Cowsheds were almost invariably filthy. More often than not, the cows were diseased and were never cleaned. The cowkeeper or milkmaids who milked the cows rarely washed their hands before beginning their chore, and would never think of washing or scouring their buckets. If bits of straw or mud or dung or the odd fly or two fell into the bucket when the cow was being milked, what did it matter? As they used to say in those old days, you've got to eat a peck of dirt before you die. The result was that milk often became polluted immediately it left the cow. Very few people knew the taste of clean, fresh milk, for by the time it reached the customer, it was usually going sour. Although some farmers did run their own pony express. As a result, only a small percentage of milk produced on the farms was consumed in its liquid form. Most of it was used to make butter and cheese. The unclean milk often produced rancid butter, and the cheeses were sometimes of dubious quality. In many towns and cities, which at the time were rapidly expanding in full flood of the Industrial Revolution, milk was usually provided by cowkeepers, who kept a few cattle in appalling conditions in wretched little sheds in the back of milk shops. In bigger cities, such as London, large town herds also existed. Often the milk was carried in open pails. Dust and dirt could easily settle on it. It may have been picturesque, but it was thoroughly insanitary and very hard work. Cowkeepers sometimes milked their animals on their customers' doorsteps, and a few enterprising keepers used their cows as a walking milk bar, selling milk straight from the cow to customer. It may not have been entirely clean, but at least the milk was fresh. One reason perhaps why warm milk was considered to be more healthy and beneficial than cold milk. In Kensington, in London, for example, a prize herd was kept in the 70 acres of Holland Park, which had one of the cleanest dairies in the country. Such dairies, however, were rare exceptions. As a general rule, the town cows were neglected and most were diseased. Foot and mouth disease, rinderpest, and cattle plague were common, and the majority of cows were infected with tuberculosis, which could be passed on to anyone who drank infected milk or ate butter and cheese produced from it. children were particularly susceptible to milk-borne tuberculosis. Typhoid, diphtheria and dysentery could also be transmitted by milk. Each year, thousands died through infected milk. It was a terrible toll, and it was to take close on a century to eradicate these diseases. In the mid-1860s, successive epidemics of cattle plague decimated whole herds and led the government to introduce the Cattle Diseases Prevention Act of 1866, which ordered infected cattle to be slaughtered. On one farm in Shropshire, 54 were destroyed in 14 days. The slaughtering of the infected town herds marked the beginning of the end for the town cowkeepers. Many advances were due to the work of the early pioneers. Among the more famous was the George Barham, who was a pioneer of early refrigeration methods and the transport of milk by railways. Before long, there was an increased demand for milk from an urban population growing rather more prosperous as benefits of the Industrial Revolution worked their way through society. As the market expanded, farmers were encouraged to improve the quality of their products as well as to invest in new equipment, such as milking machines, which were designed as early as the 1870s. The first ones were American, but the early models were not very successful. Most of them were unhygienic, and some hurt the cow. In 1892, a Dr. Shields of Glasgow made a major design breakthrough, producing an intermittent suction machine which simulated the action of a suckling calf. With the introduction of the Gillies teat-cup in 1902, the design was improved further. These early milking machines were the forerunners of the highly sophisticated equipment used today. In 1876, the British Dairy Farmers Association, now the Royal Association of British Dairy Farmers, was formed, and in 1888 they founded the British Dairy Institute. This, the first national teaching centre for dairying, later joined a college at Reading, subsequently to become the university. In 1912, a unit for dairy investigations was set up in the same college, and this became the National Institute for Research in Dairying. Thus began the skilled training and research which helped to create the modern dairy industry. Dr. Stenhouse Williams, a bacteriologist who became the first director of the National Institute for Research in Dairying, toured the farms of Britain in the 1920s, trying to convince farmers that hygiene on the farms and clean milk were essential. And Wilfred Buckley, who in 1915 had founded the National Clean Milk Society, agitated vigorously for stricter controls on the sales of clean milk. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the British dairy industry was beginning to take on a more recognizable form. The milkmen collected their milk from the railway station or from the nearby farm. Most milkmen were small traders who'd only one cart or pram and served just a few streets. But they usually made their rounds 3 times a day, starting before 6 in the morning, and each time with fresh milk. The milk was served from cans and was ladled into jugs and bowls with the aid of metal measures on the customer's doorstep. Very little milk was bottled. Clean, wholesome milk for everyone was still a long way off. The ordinary man in the street knew very little about the nature and the cause of disease, and was only just beginning to understand the link between dirt, diseases, and germs. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur had demonstrated the existence of bacteria, and had shown that wine and beer, which had been heated to a certain temperature for a given period of time, kept far better than the untreated liquid. Subsequently, the same principle was applied to milk. The heat killed the microorganisms that caused the milk to go sour and killed any germs it might contain, including one causing tuberculosis. Why, then, was heat treatment not immediately adopted by Britain's dairy industry? One reason was that many people were suspicious of heat-treated milk, believing it to be unnatural, with all its food value lost and even mysterious vital principles destroyed. In spite of this, most housewives boiled it. Even as recently as the 1930s, one MP declared, "If God had meant milk to be pasteurized, he would have made cows which worked at boiling point." It required several years of scientific work and strong agitation by the medical profession to establish that these fears were groundless. So Britain had to wait until 1922 for Parliament to define precisely what was meant by the term pasteurized milk. The legislation declared that pasteurized milk must be heated to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, 63 degrees centigrade, maintained at that temperature for 30 minutes, and then immediately cooled. This was fairly easy to do with small quantities and laboratory conditions, but was by no means easy when handling thousands of gallons in a large processing plant, and in 1922 there was no pasteurizing equipment on the market capable of producing milk to this standard in the quantities demanded. Early pasteurizing systems heated or cooled the milk by passing it over a corrugated surface, which exposed it to dirt in the atmosphere, or by passing it through enclosed tubes. The tube system worked quite well, except that to ensure that each tube was completely free from hot milk deposits, the entire machine had to be taken to pieces every day for cleaning. One of these problems, that of maintaining the right temperature for the right time without exposing the milk to air, was solved in a very ingenious way by a dairy engineer called W.G. Tarbet. The Tarbet machine, known as a positive holder, had the great advantage of being a continuous process. It consisted of 6 triangular-shaped tanks mounted on a revolving platform, which took 45 minutes to make a complete turn. Preheated milk was placed in a tank at number 1 station, whilst warm, pasteurized milk was discharged at a number 6 station. The other 4 stations kept the milk at 145 degrees. Each operation took exactly 7.5 minutes. The journey through the 4 intermediate stations, therefore, took 4 times 7.5 minutes, precisely the 30 minutes specified in the new law. The Tarbet machine, however, had the disadvantage that it did not heat the milk, neither did it cool it. These required separate processes in separate machines. These 3 processes were brought together by a heat exchanger system developed by another engineer, Dr. Richard Seligman, which revolutionized pasteurization equipment. It contained 2 extremely simple ideas. Firstly, the milk flowed in a thin layer between a series of rectangular metal plates, which were either heated or cooled on the reverse side by flowing hot or cold water. A set of plates was clamped tightly together, but was easily opened for cleaning, and in addition, the milk was never exposed to the air. Secondly, some plates carried cold milk on one side and finished hot milk on the other, so that incoming milk was partially heated, a system still used today. Milk must be cooled immediately and kept refrigerated, otherwise its flavor can be spoiled and it would not keep long. It was obviously ridiculous to put clean, pure, pasteurized milk into dirty delivery cans. If the milk was to remain clean, clean containers and clean equipment were essential. Bottling was the answer for the majority of deliveries. From the early 1920s, more and more milk was bottled. The early bottles had swing stoppers held in place with a wire clip. These were replaced by wide-necked bottles with a thick waxed cardboard cap. These caps kept the milk clean, but they did not protect the rim on which the dirt easily settled, contaminating the milk when it was poured. Today, all milk bottles must, by law, have a covered rim, which is why the dairy industry generally adopted the familiar sealed aluminium cap. During the past 50 years, government legislation has ensured that immense improvements have been made in standards of hygiene at dairy farms. Milking machines ensure that the milk is not exposed to contamination in open containers. Clean milk comes from clean cows, so before each milking, Flanks and underparts are cleaned and udders thoroughly washed. In addition, stalls, floors and walls must be kept clean. Farmers continue to improve the standards of their herds and the quality and quantity of milk they produce. All milk sold for liquid consumption must come from attested herds, which must be free from bovine tuberculosis, which in the 1920s infected 40% of all British dairy cows. Eradicating this killer disease from dairy herds has taken farmers and veterinary scientists many years. If the milk is not immediately cooled and kept cool, its flavor can be spoiled. And of course, warm milk is a marvelous breeding ground for germs and would rapidly become contaminated. For this reason, refrigeration on the farm is as vital as it is at the dairy. Insulated tankers keep the milk cool while it's being transported. The traditional milk churn has disappeared. The dairy industry has become more and more sophisticated, using complicated, expensive equipment requiring skilled operation. And in the years since the Second World War, millions of pounds have been invested by dairy farmers and the dairy companies to guarantee milk supplies. It is an investment which has benefited every family in the country.